Here we go. And for people at home, you probably will get a little message saying this thing's being recorded. You can just turn it off because it's just an advice. All right, let's make a start. Go for it.
Great. Great. Um, just just to be clear, I'm honorary with ANU, not with University of Wollongong.
Oh
Uh,
my goodness.
not that any of that really particularly matters, but just in case University of Wollongong say we don't want anything to do with that guy. So just to make that clear. Anyway, I'll just go through a little bit of the background of fire in Australia and a lot of what has shaped our thinking on the subject. And then I'll go into some more of the science on it and what we can do with fire, what all of this means for fire management and for planned burns. So what this is a series of graphs, and there won't be too many graphs in this because I know not everybody is keen on graphs. But what we're looking at is a really long time series from the top of the graph is present, and we're going back. You can see on the y-axis on the left, we're going back to about 40 million years ago. So we're still not quite back to Gondwana yet. But on the right-hand side, you can see that in roughly the last 10 million years, there's big bars under fire history. So there's been a lot more fire that has happened in the last 10 million years. But before that, fire was comparatively rare, comparatively uncommon. And if you look right over at the left, what you'll see is comparison of what dominated the pollen during these different times. And so at the left-hand side, we've got this dark lump showing that Nothofagus was the sort of, if you're familiar with it, it's one of our rainforest plants that really dominates Tasmania, and you've got Nothofagus cunninghamii in Victoria. And so it's very indicative of rainforest. Whereas in more recent years, as we get more fire, we start getting more myrtaceae, so more eucalypts. And there's a general change in that climate from rainforest through to sclerophyll forest. And one of the things that's often said in Australia is that our vegetation evolved with fire. And from that, we tend to take the conclusion, therefore, it needs fire. Fire and our vegetation go together. And we do see this increase in myrtaceae in recent years. But when I say recent years, sort of the last 10 to 20 million years, which so the question is, though, is that because of fire? And is fire a necessary thing that's come out of that? And one way we can start to understand that is to look at specific species that are claimed to be fire dependent. So, for example, Banksia. This is a famous article that Banksia was born to burn. That the cones are covered in sort of flammable dry leaves, and they open when they're heated by fire, and so they thrive from fire. So you would call that a fire adapted plant. It's an adaptive trait because it works in a fire environment. You get a lot more seed production and a lot more seed released into the environment if you have fire there. And so you'll often see with Banksias a big flush of Banksia growth when there's been a fire. But does that mean it was actually an evolutionary response to fire? Well, in evolution, you have either adaptations or exaptations. An exaptation is something that's a change that the evolutionary pressure was one thing, but this change also allows it to work in another situation. And part of Australia's history is that our soils are very old. We've got a lot of low nutrient soils, And so there were a lot of plants that evolved to deal with low nutrient soils or with low rainfall conditions at times. And as a result, that means they've got a lot of protective measures in place. So if you have a few years with no good rain, you may just want to have your seed protected. And Banksias are very good at holding that seed in, and they'll just release it in a slow, steady trickle year after year. So if the situation becomes variable, then you have, if you happen to get a good year, then you'll get a flush of Banksia growing. And when we look at the oldest Banksia fossils there are, interestingly, they come from 40 million years ago, long before fire was a common thing in Australia. So Banksia evolved long before there was frequent fire in the country. So the argument that a lot of our vegetation evolved and needs fire doesn't really stand up the more you look at it, because as you start looking at individual species where this is claimed, you can see one after another that there are exaptations. There are other reasons why plants might have these traits. For example, resprouting evolved in rainforests. A huge number of rainforest species resprout because it's just a very useful way of keeping hold of your original genetic material. Just as your trunks get old, just keep sending up new ones. So the next thing that's raised is, well, didn't First Nations Aboriginal people burn the bush all the time? And so, if they did that, then shouldn't we continue with what they're doing? So to answer that, I suppose let's start with a story that I was told by Bermeringal elder Uncle Rod Mason, who he's from the New South Wales South Coast, and he showed me a campsite along a travel route between the coast and the high mountains in Tidbinniga, which is the Snowy Mountains. And every spring they would travel up this route to spend the summer in Tidbinniga and then come back again in autumn. And in spring and autumn they'd camp at this campsite. Now, in the way culture is structured there, you have what's called a distributed knowledge system. So different people have ownership of different types of knowledge. No one person knows everything that needs to be done. So, for example, there were people who had what's called bagal, means kinship, with a species of wattle called matruk. And they would watch the matruk, and when the matruk flowers started to fall from the plant, they'd come and let the rest of the group know that that had happened. And then the people who had kinship with rain would watch the mountain just to the east of them called Yilagambra. Yilagambra was the rainmaker, and they'd watch him for the point when cloud would form on his head, because what that was advance warning that there's wet winds coming in off the ocean that are going to be bringing mist or rain. And when that happened, they would walk up the hill and they'd thank Yilagambra by throwing out a fire stick into the bush and call out Budjiri Yilagamo, which is, thank you, Yilagambra, for your country. It's good country. And then they'd walk away. Now, a lot of people would hear that story and think, well, that they've just lit a fire and walked away from it. That's going to turn into a bushfire. But actually, because of the kinship relationship with Matruk Wattle, it set it at a specific time in spring when this burn happened. Because of the kinship with rain, they watched Yilagambra Mountain, and this is also an aspect of what's called place-based knowledge. In place-based knowledge, it only works for the location that you are applying the knowledge. So this only works for this campsite near Yilagambra Mountain. And so by having that place-based knowledge and the kinship with Yilagambra, you've got an exact dew point set at the top of the mountain, and you've got an incoming wave of really cool, wet air coming in off the ocean. And so you then follow that up with a single point ignition from your fire stick on the top of the hill, which spreads really slowly because fire spreads slower downslope and also spreads slower coming out from a single point because it makes all of the flames pull into the middle. So as that fire spreads out slowly, it takes a long time to get anywhere. And by the time it's burnt just a very short distance, the wet wind has come in off the coast and put the fire out. So in the end, you end up with a very low intensity fire that's just burnt a very small patch. And this is really important because all around the Wadbilliga campsite were a whole lot of shrubs that they relied on for the berries. They'd fruit in autumn. And if you don't burn that country, eventually the shrubs just start to thin out and start to disappear, and you don't have enough food there. So you need to burn it. But if you burn too much, you've got no food when you come back that following autumn. So you have to burn exactly the right amount. And you can only get there by knowing this full tradition and burning these tiny little patches one at a time. So what he's described there is a use of fire that is something like the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. It's an extremely specific use of fire, and it's not affecting the rest of the body. You're only changing the thing that you want to change. Now, if we compare that to the way colonisers understood Aboriginal fire use, this is a quote from Townsend, who was surveying in Tidbilliga in the Snowy Mountains in the 1840s. And what happened was that he got there to survey and he saw that his survey area had been burnt. And he said it was because Aboriginal people went up there and lit huge fires to catch moths. Now, first thing to note is that he actually didn't see them do that. All he saw was burnt country. And at this stage, you'd had graziers in that country for about 10 years, and their practice was to burn really frequently. So it was almost certainly graziers that had burnt his country. But he assumed to start with that it was Aboriginal people. But then what he also did was, Aboriginal nations would come from all the surrounding country, from a long way inland and right from the coast, and all gather up in Tidbilliga for the summer. And it was a kind of a United Nations thing where they'd work through all sorts of international issues between them all, and there'd be marriages and all sorts of festivities, and they'd feast on the moths. And Townsend's concept was that they went up, set up camp up there, all of these nations, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, and then lit massive bushfires all around themselves to catch moths. And that was his concept of it. Now, just a few years later, his name's going to disappear from my mind for the moment. It will come back to me. Somebody else actually watched them catching moths up there. And the way they did it was the moths gather in granite caves, sort of gaps between the boulders, and they will just completely cover the face of a boulder. And what you would do is bring a skin or a sheet of bark or something like that and put it on the ground underneath them, and then wave a burning stick over the moths, and they'd all fall onto the skin or the piece of bark, and you'd pull them out and cook them up, and there's your food. That actually makes sense. That would catch you more moths than setting a bushfire going around yourself and hoping they fall out of the sky for you or something like that. But culturally, we've accepted this story that they burnt that whole country because it just came from this one brief little misfire in Townsend's brain that made him think that this must be what's happening. And culturally, we've then built on that and used it to build this prescribed burning industry, where in the 1950s and 1960s, we developed this approach where MacArthur said that, yeah, Aboriginal people burnt country with a fire stick, but we can do better by throwing incendiaries out of a plane. And so it's essentially saying, look, Yeah, you use fire like a scalpel, but a scalpel's just a kind of a knife, really, and our knife's bigger, so that must be better. But different knives have different jobs. Now, notice right at the end here that fire historian Stephen Pine has thrown lasers into the picture, saying that we light up our prescribed burns using lasers from aircraft. Just to be clear, that has never happened. That is not something that we do. We don't have lasers in aircraft. There are no space lasers. We don't do that. But somehow or other, he got that idea, even though he was able to talk to Alan MacArthur and get the information directly from him. So that should give us some idea of how much confidence we put in these ideas that we have about Aboriginal fire in the landscape. There's not a lot of scholarship that goes into this. Now, one thing that often comes out of discussions around all of this is the idea of scrubbing up, concerns about scrubbing up. That, the story is always, well, the forest used to be really open and you could gallop a horse through it, and now it's really dense, and a lot of people are concerned because we can see that in a lot of areas there used to be huge, broadly spaced trees, and now there's a whole lot of small saplings around the place. And so in this photo here, the foreground shows the forest with an open understory, and in the background, you've got a really dense understory that you've got a scrub bash to get through. So how did this happen? Well, the popular story around this is that it happened because we prevented Aboriginal people from doing frequent burning in the forests. Frequent burning, we tell ourselves, was what kept the understory open. There's a bit more to that story, though. First thing to notice about it, if ever you read that in a book, it's not referenced to any Aboriginal person who has kept that traditional knowledge. See, we've got a long history in post-colonisation Australia of destroying Aboriginal knowledge. We have worked in a very concerted way to get rid of that information. But there were people who, I remember one woman telling me about her grandmother hiding in the ferns when the black government cars came around to snatch the kids. There's another elder that I know who was just too sick, and the people coming around to grab the kids just weren't interested in taking her. There were others whose skin was a little bit darker than they were interested in. There were others who got taken, and even though if they spoke their language in the mission or they told any of their stories to each other, they could be severely punished for doing that, and some pretty horrific punishments. They still did that. They still had whispered conversations and still kept that culture alive. And so there are these people around the country who are not easy to find. They're not out there with a microphone. They're the people who have learnt to hide that information. And they have kept that information and have that knowledge of what traditional fire looks like. People like Uncle Rod Mason, who told me that story. And when you hear those stories, you hear about people who just burnt a little stand of trees somewhere, but not the other trees right next to them. Sometimes there were areas that were completely and deliberately left unburnt. The red tingle forests in Western Australia. There's an area of woodland managed largely by the Ngaju people in WA. This area of Ngada woodland is larger than the area of Tasmania, and they specifically and deliberately never burnt it. They kept fire out of it because if you burnt it, the regrowth was too dense to walk through. And that's a really interesting point. The fact that they know that it's really dense regrowth think back again on Uncle Rod Mason's story. His purpose of burning was not to keep the forest open. It was actually to create dense regrowth there. Now, that's not always the case. Some people would burn the same spot every year because they want to camp there, for example. So they're burning a little patch every year specifically to clear it. They're not trying to conserve anything there. They're trying to create bare ground to camp on. They will often look after specific trees or any plants that they really want cared for, but the purpose there is to create bare ground. Uncle Rod burnt to create dense shrub regrowth because they wanted the fruit on the shrubs. And so when we look back through history, we see people who noticed this. Richard Helms was the name I was trying to think of before, who watched the moth gathering. He also noticed that, there was the reason we burnt in this country, the reason colonizers burnt was because we were colonizers, because we wanted to change the landscape. We were moving into country to try and change it, to adapt it to British livestock and British forms of agriculture. And so you burnt to produce a flush of grass growth. And what Richard Helms noticed was that, yeah, that worked for a little while, but then the scrub came back thicker than it had been before. And the more you did it, the more the scrub came back. After the 1939 fires in Victoria, the Black Friday fires that killed 71 people, Judge Stretton made the point that he was presiding over the Royal Commission. He made the point that this introduced a cycle of destruction which cannot be arrested in our day. The scrub grew and flourished. Fire was used to clear it. The scrub grew faster and thicker. This was his main explanation as to why the fires were so severe. People caused the fires, people started the fires, but the reason they burnt severely was because people had been burning all the time before then and producing this dense shrub growth. Charles Lane Poole was the Inspector General of Australian Forests, and he had worked as Inspector General or Conservator of Forests for decades by this point, by the time he testified in that Royal Commission. And he very clearly said that the reason our forests have dense understory regrowth is because we're burning them. And if we want them to be open, we need to protect them from fire. The Australian Academy of Science noticed the same thing, commented on the same thing, of forests that used to have grassy understories that were now shrubby. And it wasn't just scientists. The Rogers family at Walgalmarang on the Lower Snowy and the hills around there recorded in 1970 from generations of watching their burning practices on their cattle station that they had changed the country from being open forest into dense, impassable, scrubby country because they had burnt it on an as often as possible basis. In 2006, I interviewed a series of old graziers who used to have snow leases up in Kosciuszko before it was a national park. And many of them would tell me this, that they specifically avoided burning bush country because it made it scrubby and dense. There's a legendary Australian ecologist, Ray Specht, who summarised it in this way, that essentially what he's saying is that if you burn or you scorch a plant, a new plant will come back to replace it, but it will grow from the ground up. So if you've got a tall plant, a tree or a mid-story plant or a tall shrub, you scorch that, you'll get a small plant growing. You take away the overstory and you get an increase in understory. When we look across Victoria, what we see is a trend that was noted by a series of researchers at University of Melbourne, who found that this trend continues as an average across all Victorian forests. You burn them, you produce a flush of shrub growth that then self-thins later on. So this is the overall trend. What importance does that have for fire? So fire behaviour, the way we understand fire behaviour, comes down to Um, Most of what we think of with fire behavior is discussions about something we call fuel load. The concept of fuel load was developed in the 1950s by an American forester named George Byram, who was trying to develop tools for burning pine forest. And Byram talked about the layer of pine needles on the ground as fuel. And this was a whole new concept of measuring fuel by weight. We hadn't done that before because shrubs don't weigh very much compared to leaf litter. When you look at the amount of leaves on a shrub, it's much smaller than the amount of leaf litter. Um, Now, Alan MacArthur brought that idea to Australia. He's another Australian forester, and he published a leaflet with these 9 data points on it and said that if you double the fuel load, you double the rate of spread. Now, this is basically gospel. Now, it's unquestionable in Australia, and it is still used constantly. Um, Most of our fire planning in New South Wales and Victoria is done using a model called Phoenix Rapid Fire. Phoenix is run by the University of Melbourne, and at its core, it depends on this idea that you double the fuel load, you double the rate of spread. The problem is we know that it isn't true. Alan MacArthur just published it in a leaflet. He never properly analysed the data, never released that data. But it was replicated in the 1990s by Neil Burrows in WA, who performed a series of very meticulous experiments and showed there was no relationship whatsoever. Again, it was tested by Michael Story at Uni of Wollongong and his team, where they compared the rate of spread of wildfires with the fuel load in those areas. And again, no relationship. That number at the bottom, R squared equals 0.001, means that fuel load explained about 1,000th of the variation in fire spread there. And if you're explaining less than maybe 20% of the variation, you generally say it's probably not a real thing. It's worth ignoring. The overall fuel hazard guide that is used for fire management now to when there's a prescribed burn or to look at whether a prescribed burn is needed. You run this visual assessment across the landscape and come up with an overall fuel hazard score. Right in the front of that guide for years now has been this little picture telling us that it's not the weight of fuel, it's the structure of the fuel there, that you can take the same weight of newspaper, and if you just crumple it loosely, you'll get a bigger flame from it. The biggest set of fire experiments conducted so far in Australia was Project Vesta, and they concluded that it is not the fuel load, it's the height and the cover of the understory that drives fire behaviour. And finally, my work that I conducted with a team from across a series of different universities to develop a mechanistic fire behaviour model and to validate that model showed that it is not the weight of leaf litter on the ground, it's the structure and the composition of the vegetation. And I'll go into that now, how that works. So if you have a forest with a shrub layer like this that's burning, you'll get a big flame. But notice in the background that the trees aren't burning. In the Black Summer fires, that was the case for about 88% of the area. There was crown fire for 12% of the area, and the other 88% of the area, the trees weren't burning. And what that means is that underneath the trees, the wind isn't as strong. If you stand out in a paddock, the wind will blow your hat off your head. If you stand underneath the trees, you're protected from the wind. And so because there's less wind underneath the trees for 88% of that area, then that fire was spreading much slower. The biomass of the trees was actually slowing the fire down. So a lot of science now using this fuel load concept kind of just uses shorthand to call it biomass. But in this case, we've got over 88% of the Black Summer area, the biomass was actually slowing the fire down, the upper biomass. Now, what happens is that over time, those shrubs grow into taller shrubs. And when they become taller shrubs, they take the light and their roots take more of the water and the nutrients, and you get thinning of fuels on the ground underneath. So there's less fuel on the ground. And now those taller shrubs have become mid-story, and they're actually slowing the wind speed themselves. So that's why we have, under the same conditions, a flame that's burning much lighter fuels, and the biomass, more of the biomass has become what's called overstory shelter, slowing the wind speed down. This is part of what a series of studies that we're doing on what's called ecological control theory. How do forests actually control fire spread? How have they managed fire since Gondwana? Because forests have been living with fire in Australia for a long, long time, and they didn't have us here to burn the fuels away and manage them for them. Forests have maintained a suite of fire-sensitive species throughout that time without us here to save them from themselves. So ecological controls are ways that changes in the growth and the succession of plants cause fires to become smaller and have smaller flames and spread slower over time, so that they go out having burnt less country. So let's have a look at what that means now for fire management. In this picture, you can see there's a little inset graph here, that the little rectangle, and the black line in there is just a sort of a rough little graph showing where most of the biomass is. Most of the biomass here is in the treetops, and it's green because that is slowing the fire down. That's the overstory shelter. There's a little bit of yellow just at the bottom of that because there's a little bit of fuel on the ground. So we've got a low flammability forest here. Now, if we burn that forest, we can make it even lower flammability because we remove that layer of fuel off the ground. So now there's only overstory shelter there and no fuel, just bare ground. But, of course, plants regrow. And so after a little while, you've now got dense understory regrowth, as we've seen happens right across Victoria and is the common pattern for Australia. And when you've got that dense understory there, in this situation, I've now coloured all of that yellow or orangey yellow because those shrubs may actually cause a crown fire. You've got ladder fuels there that allow the canopy to burn. So the canopy has stopped being overstory shelter and has become fuel. So this is now a really high flammable situation. But given time, we know that those shrubs self-thin and we return back to the original state. So this is the trend that we see and that I've modelled using, I predicted this back during my thesis from the mechanistic modelling that I told you about just a little while ago. But then I've gone through and started measuring it across the landscape. And what we see across the landscape, this is across the Australian Alps National Parks. I divided them up into major forest groupings and I looked at the mapped fire histories. So none of this is theoretical. This is looking at what has historically happened across all of those different forest types. So whether you're talking about open woodland in the Snowy River Valley or snowgum woodland or alpine ash forest, all of these communities have this same trend of an increasing likelihood that fire will happen and that it will be crown fire. It's still quite a small one. We're looking at maximum here about 1% likelihood, 1 in 100 chance in a given year. But that then drops back down as those forests get older. You can see there's different timing for different forest types, and some of them get far more likely to have crown fire than others do. But eventually they drop down and you get this low flammability state in all of those different forests. But it's not just me that's measured this stuff. This is work that was done looking at the forests in Victoria burnt during the Black Summer. And we've got 3 different EVCs, ecological vegetation classes. We've got lowland, wet or damp forest, and dry forest up the top. And we've got a longer time span here that we're looking at up to 300 years. And so the graph is a little bit more cramped towards the left, but we're just seeing exactly this same trend that following fire, you get a peak, a pulse of increased flammability that then drops back down again. This is another study that was conducted looking at wildfires across New South Wales by a team from University of Wollongong. And again, they found the same thing, an increase in the likelihood of crown fire about 10 years after fire that then declined. Another study from University of Wollongong looked at crown fire likelihood in forests around Sydney, the Blue Mountains and the Illawarra. And again, you see this sort of a hump in the middle, but by the time you get to 30 years after fire, crown fire is actually really rare. And to be clear, I have not seen studies saying differently to this. When we actually look at these trends in detail, this is exactly what we find every time. So how does that apply to planned burning? If this is the case, that that planned burning just gives us this tiny little blip in the radar of reduced flammability, but then gives us a really long period of increased flammability, what do we do about that? Well, part of the problem is that AFAC, which is the Australasian Fire Authorities Council, this is the governing council of where all of the different fire authorities from different states, they're all members and they're all signatories to a position statement that says that prescribed burning is essential. And when you are signatories to this position statement, it's really difficult to come out and say, I disagree with this position. And so if you are employed by a fire agency, or if you are funded by a fire agency at a university, you're in a very difficult position if you want to come out and disagree with the official position there. So there's a whole lot of pressure on people to comply. Now, the reason they say that it's essential is because of this document that goes through a series of papers. And what it centres on is the work by Project Vesta, which was that big burning program in southwest WA. And they make this very critical statement that I've highlighted here. It says stimulation of understory shrub growth, shrub regeneration after burning will not increase the rate of spread of a fire until such time as a significant near surface fuel layer accumulates. So what they're saying is whether the shrub layer comes back in a pulse or not is not actually important. It's the near surface layer that's important. So where does that come from? And why did Project Vesta focus on that? Well, this is an excerpt from the report, and you can see that in the lower part of what I've underlined there. It says it's even been argued that hazard reduction burning may actually enhance the propagation of wildfire by promoting shrub regeneration in areas which may otherwise have inherently low fire-prone characteristics. Now, you can hear the horror in that statement that someone would dare to make such a ridiculous claim. And it's referenced to Anonymous 1994. So clearly we don't know who that is. But coincidentally, in 1994, someone else from the same department published this graph showing shrub regeneration in these exact forests. And they showed that this very, very clear trend, the pulse in shrubs in Jarrah Forest, you get an increasing cover of shrubs up to about 22 years after fire, and then they self-thin. So you can look at the biomass of shrubs at 50 years is about the same as it is at 1 year after fire. So if you want a low shrub cover, either you've got to burn it every year or not burn it for at least 50 years. This was from their own department. And so this suggests, you can see it's the same humped shape as I've shown here. And as we saw in all of those empirical studies from different areas, so you can see where there's concern that's come out of this. So how did they come to the conclusion that that actually doesn't matter, that it's actually just about the near surface fuels? So by near surface fuels, you are talking about grasses and dead material that is suspended in the shrubs, or else you're talking about old, dead, collapsed shrubs that last for another couple of years after they've died, just as dead branches. So we'll look at the back of the report here, and apologies if this is getting a little bit too sciencey, but what this is that we are comparing correlation between different possible drivers of rate of spread and rate of spread itself. And what these numbers are, if you've got a number of 1, it means that it's 100% perfect explanation. If a number of 0 means it doesn't explain anything at all. The best explaining value, well, let's look at near surface fuel hazard score. It explains 0.56. So that's fairly strong. And the 2 little asterisks there mean that it's a statistically significant thing. So it's something that's important. But the best explaining value is the elevated fuel hazard score. That's the shrubs. It's slightly better than the near surface. They're very, very similar though. And the reason they're very similar is, if you remember, the near surface fuels tend to largely be leaves that are hanging in the shrubs. So if you don't have shrubs, you don't have near surface. Now, what happened was that Project Vesta created a rate of spread equation where they couldn't use both of these because they're what's called autocorrelated. When you have more shrubs, you have more near surface fuel, because the only way you could have near surface fuel is if it's suspended in those shrubs. So you can't use both. But instead of choosing the one with the stronger fit, they chose near surface. And by choosing that, they were then able to say that what matters is the near surface fuels, not the shrubs. So there was a little bit of sleight of hand there. Interestingly, the Project Vesta data has since been reanalyzed, and the publication in 2022 has come out and said the best descriptor is the height and the cover of the understory. There's none of this stuff about near surface anymore. It's the understory. Near surface plays into that. It's a component of it. You combine it into that, but it's about the height and the cover of the understory overall. So that statement in the AFAC position statement is no longer relevant, but it's still binding on state agencies. So what's the next trick? Well, that's to, if we look back up at the graph in the top left, focus on this area that I've shaded in here. You can see there's this line of increasing fire risk straight after fire. If we only focus on that line, then we see that as time since fire increases, the flammability of that forest increases. So if you look at studies looking at the effectiveness of prescribed burning, invariably they focus only on this area here. They do not check for a long-term trend to see whether there is a decline afterwards, unless they're rat bags like me. So looking at the Project Vesta experimental work, what they did was had a series of burn plots that they burnt to measure fire behaviour from. And these plots had fire in them in the past at different times. Some had very recent fire, and the oldest ones had fire up to 22 years earlier. Now, do you remember that number 22? I mentioned it just a little while ago. That was Dr. Burrows' measurements of shrub cover. The coincidentally released 1994 data that suggested that burning may actually increase fire risk. They picked plots that only went up to this point of maximum shrub cover. Now, I don't know what happened. It may be a coincidence, but it's a pretty interesting coincidence that it stopped right there at 22 years and they didn't measure any plots in this age range where you would expect fire rates of spread to be decreasing because the shrub layer is decreasing. So a few years ago, I and a team I was working with thought, well, let's look at the mapped fire histories for Southwest WA, because this is the basis of the national position statement on fire. This is the central argument as to why prescribed burning is essential for the country. So we look at those mapped fire histories, and what we would expect is if the forests are most flammable in this period around 22 years when there's the most shrubs, then we would expect to see the most bushfire in the landscape around that time. And we'd expect to see less bushfire burning patches of forest that had just been burnt really recently, or else really long unburnt patches. And that is the exact trend that we measured. Not a perfect fit, but you can see that it increases over time and then it decreases later on. It's a fairly approximate fit to that shrub trend, but it shows the same overall trend there. Now, this stirred up some controversy amongst people who were managing fire over there, because it was saying essentially that the reason the forests were flammable there was because they were burning them. That if they wanted less fire risk in Southwest WA, they needed to not be burning them. And it goes against the principle outlined in the AFAC agreement. And so there was a lot of back and forth. And one of the main things that came out was that they argued everything to the right of this line here was bad data. It's their data, but it was bad data. And so they said, we should take out all data to the right of this line. Now, notice where the line falls at the exact peak. Now, when we looked at that data, we said, well, going by your definitions of bad data, actually 1.6% of that area is bad data. So why throw away the other 98.4%? Why not just throw away the 1.6% of bad data? And we did that, and we redid the analysis, and this is the curve now. So there was a little bit of an own goal there on their part, where we now have much, much stronger evidence showing that the central argument for prescribed burning in Australia turns out to have been a furphy. That prescribed burning is what has caused the fire risk in Southwest WA. It's not the cure, it's the cause. The reason we get this increase in inflammability is because prescribed burning has driven it. So I better speed up a little bit here. I'm going to run myself out of time. But I'm going to look a little bit at how fire impacts plants and the environment, plants and animals. So in Victoria, I've been a bit involved in situations looking at burning impacts on greater gliders. And DECA have been doing surveys of greater gliders, and this is an example from one of the reports. And you can see this, the black area outlines a prescribed burning block. The white dots show where they ran transects looking at greater gliders. They were measuring them before and after the prescribed burn. The orange area shows areas where there was just a little bit of canopy scorch, and the pink areas showed that about half the canopy has been scorched. So if it's a fire-sensitive tree, that's enough to kill the canopy there. First thing to notice is that the transects actually barely cross any of this area where there's fire that was mapped by satellite. Mostly they're in areas that show up as unburnt here. Now, they're not quite unburnt. And here's a little bit of a trick with it, because I've overlaid that mapping here with what was mapped by hand by the fire crews at the time. And you can see in this red area, there's quite a lot more country that they mapped from looking at as being burnt. And the reason they know this was burnt was because they went along there with the drip torches and set it on fire. So they know it was burnt. So the satellite can't pick it up that it's burnt. But still, we see that the greater gliders are in this really either unburnt or very lightly burnt country, the stuff that they'd surveyed. So we're not actually finding out from the surveys whether the prescribed burns are impacting the greater gliders or not. And there's another interesting thing about this, that if all of this country was so lightly burnt that it didn't even show up as burnt to the satellite, what does that tell us? Because you see, one of the arguments that prescribed burning is safe for greater gliders is that when prescribed burns are being conducted, they're using very careful specialist lighting techniques. And I've used these techniques myself. I know them very well. You also have the option of using a hose to put out a tree if it catches fire. But the point is that it's all happening close to the road. So you will do these specialist lighting techniques and they'll keep the fire behavior down really low until you get 100 or 200 meters into the burning block. Then it all joins up and none of that matters anymore. Once you are in the heart of that burning block, and particularly once you're out here where the helicopter's just throwing out incendiaries, none of what you're doing at the road's edge has any effect. So at the road's edge, you've got people saying, we need to keep the fire really calm here because we don't want to hurt the greater gliders. And this is their expert opinion on what is safe fire for greater gliders. This stuff, you can see right here how close that is to the road's edge on the southern end of it. It's just a really narrow strip of what they think is safe for the greater gliders. Everywhere else that shows up as detectable from the satellite as being burnt was country that those fire practitioners on the road, it burnt in a way that they considered too severe for the gliders, for themselves. But we don't see that from the road. It's back inside the block. So the point with all of this is that our surveys are not telling us whether greater gliders, for example, are safe or not. So the fire modelling that I do can test this sort of thing theoretically. First of all, we can look at plants. Like in this situation here, that these are, I won't go into detail in these graphs. What they show is heating into the soil and into the trunks of trees to see if you're going to kill a tree. And each line shows over a period of 120 minutes or so what the temperature is at different depths in the soil or different depths in a mature tree trunk or a sapling tree trunk or a mature tree trunk, and whether it will get hot enough to do what's called girdling the tree, to kill that tree. So that was stuff that I published in 2021. But then I looked at the effect using a similar approach, looking at western ringtail possums in southwest WA. A prescribed burn had been conducted in this Tuart woodland. And the way that burn was conducted was to ignite grass trees like this, a bulgur. It had a skirt of dry leaves underneath. Now, grass tree skirts are really important to fauna on the ground, because what they do is when they come down to the ground, they create a microclimate underneath them that is cool in summer and warm in winter, keeps them dry. And you'll often see, if you look at the skirt of a grass tree, of an old one, there's a little circle of bare ground around it. And sometimes there's little holes in the base of it. And it's because of all of the small animals that are constantly using it. It's a main thoroughfare. It's their refuge during heat waves and rain and cold weather. So they're really important to keep. But if you want to reduce the fuel load of a block, one thing that is often done is to burn the skirts of the grass trees. Now, the problem with that here's a little bit of in this hollow above there, it was the home of a western ringtail possum. So you've got that directly above the grass tree, and you might be seeing a problem here as we're looking at it. Here's a little bit of modeling from my model frame compared with a photo of what flame looks like in a grass tree. So each of these white lines shows what a flame looks like on a second by second basis there. We can see all of this heat going straight up to that hollow. And when I model that heat penetration into the hollow, this red line is the temperature inside the hollow. And because it gets over this horizontal black line here, you've now got lethal temperatures. It's now hot enough that it will burn the airways of the greater glider, who may stay there in the hollow and asphyxiate in the hollow because the lungs stop working from internal burns, or it may try to escape. But now the hollow is surrounded by hot air or by flame. And so what ended up happening out of that, and a little bit of warning, it's a horrible picture, but the glider the ringtail possum that lived in that hollow was killed. This is him. 77% of this critically endangered species were killed from this one prescribed burn, which burnt at technically on the books very low intensity because it spread very, very slowly. So I predicted with frame between 62 and 79%. So that's right within that range there. And I can actually predict from that the way that the different possums died from this. So we can work it out mechanistically. We can get a very good idea of what the risk to animals is. And we know that there is a risk and that our surveys are not picking that risk up properly. So tying it together, how do we manage this bushfire risk? Well, one term you'll often hear used is the terminology of strategic fire management. There used to be a hectare target, and now we're told we don't keep to a hectare target anymore. We use strategic planning. And what that looks like is something like this. Here, there's a map with a proposed burn block on it, and each one of these numbers marks a theoretical ignition point. If a fire started at this point, what the number tells us is how many less hectares would be burnt if we do this prescribed burn. So if a fire started at any one of these points, the prescribed burn will reduce its size by a certain amount there. And so this is run over thousands and thousands of iterations, and it's a really good idea running things this way. It's a very clever idea, and it will strategically give you an idea of where these things are likely to have the most effect in stopping a fire. The problem with it is that this is all done using the model Phoenix Rapid Fire, which, as I mentioned before, is built on that claim that doubling the fuel load doubles the rate of spread. So everything that it does, all of the predictions come from that one disproved idea. The reason it says that doing this burn block will reduce a fire starting here by 56,000 hectares is because it says you've reduced the fuel load, so the rate of spread is slower. All of it is based on a disproved idea, something that we know to be disproved. And so as a result, this is from an area where I used to work in Kosciuszko, and somebody had conducted a prescribed burn on the left-hand side of the road there. Low intensity prescribed burn, but you can see the density of the regrowth on the left-hand side of the road compared to the right-hand side that was long unburnt. Now, if you look at the fuel load, the weight of fuel on the ground, there's a lot on the right-hand side. There's all of that fallen material there, all of those dead sticks and bark, that sort of thing. But from a fire behaviour perspective, if we believe the science, then we can see that what is going to give us the big flames is all of that understory fuel, the height and the cover of the understory. Down here, yeah, we'll get smouldering logs, but we won't get big, fast flames. We'll have slow spreading flames that we can contain. So what is the alternative? I'll finish with a story. During the Black Summer, um, someone, an arsonist, lit a fire up on the mountain behind my house in the middle of the Black Summer. Now, all around Wollongong, where I live, we'd had smoke blanketing the sky for weeks. We're just waiting for fire to happen. And an arsonist lit a fire in the middle of that situation. Now, nobody knew this at the time. We went walking up the mountain and found this burnt patch a few days after the fire had happened. But notice something. It's burnt on the left, but it's not burnt on the right. This burnt a tiny little patch. I walked around it. I've been studying it ever since. I walked the edges of it. I found that this fire had stopped all by itself at a wombat track on the uphill slope. And on the downhill slopes, it had just stopped by itself in this forest. Why would that happen? Well, there's some Dharawal knowledge for this area. Now, it's not actually specific to Mount Kembla, so I won't try to say that this is a specific story for this place. But in Dharawal country, they talk about Lyrebird country, which they call Yandelara, means peace country. Peace country is where you go to for refuge. Now, two people lived in Yandelara. There was Murugan and Urawong, and they were lovers. But one day, a young man named Berry was jealous, and he speared Murugan in the back and hit Urawong over the head and carried her off over his shoulder. Now, Murugan wasn't killed. He managed to get up after a little while, and he saw where Berry had run off, and he limped off after him. And he followed him for a few days, and eventually Urawong managed to escape from him, and she fled back to Yandelara, just hiding her tracks along the way. Murugan caught up to Berry after Urawong had escaped from him, and he saw that she'd escaped, and he had a dilemma of, do I go back to Yandelara and find her now, or do I go after Berry for revenge? And he chose to go with revenge. But because he was weakened, he wasn't able to catch up to him, and he wasn't able to get his revenge. And eventually he gave up and started heading back to Yandelara. Meanwhile, Urawong got back there, and she was looking for Murugan everywhere. And she couldn't find him. All she found was the patch of blood at the creekside where he'd been speared. And eventually she gave up. She decided that he had died and the spirits must have taken his body. And she was so overcome with grief that she lay down on the ground, covered herself with the flowers of Yandelara, and died. Murugan got back home shortly after, and he found Urawong there, and he realized what had happened, that she'd given up. And it was because he had gone after Berry in revenge. And he was so full of remorse that he lay down next to her and died next to her. The spirits saw this, and they were so saddened by it that they turned them into two species of rainforest tree that we have here in the genus Cryptocoria. Now, the interesting thing with Cryptocoria, with the two species, Murugan, Cryptocoria microneura, grows, it likes moist conditions, but it can cope with fairly dry conditions. But Urawong, Cryptocoria glaucescens, needs much wetter conditions. And so you'll often see Murugan growing up in these drier areas. But if he gets to a large enough size, he then creates a microclimate underneath him, where the air is so much cooler as you walk under the trees, and moister. And once that happens, once you get that microclimate, then Urawong starts to grow there. And so in Yandellera, in Peace Country, things are right when Murugan and Urawong are together. And once they are together, they create this environment um, where you get a tall mid-story of these two Cryptocoria species covering about 90% of the area. And that 90% cover gives you such a cool, moist understory that it shades out dense growth on the ground. And it's enough that in this situation, it stopped that fire because that's what this was. The arsonist didn't realize, he didn't know the story of Murugan and Urawong. And he'd lit the fire there, and the fire had gone out by itself. Wollongong was saved from wildfire by Yandellera, by Peace Country. And the way we get this Peace Country is by leaving that forest alone, by letting Murugan and Urawong live together in peace, untouched and undisturbed. Now, the problem is that when you do disturb them, you can see now on the left-hand side where the fire burnt, there's dense regrowth. We've now got that dense understory coming back. It's a very low intensity fire that burnt through there because it went out by itself. If we look from the forest, from underneath Murugan and Urawong, we can see what the understory looks like. It's very open here, just very scattered little ferns throughout it. But it's and you can see you've also got cabbage tree palms in there, Darawal. But in the background, in the distance, you've got that dense regrowth there. Now, eventually that will turn back into forest. It's all fine. It's all how it's supposed to go. But at the moment, that will not stop fire. At the moment, if that patch burnt, it would burn with uncontrollable fire. So what do we do? The first thing we need to do is to understand how the forest works, understand these natural cycles, these natural ways of slowing fire and of reducing fire risk. And we need to not disrupt them. We need to drop our old science that says, oh, but look at the fuel age. We've got to stop thinking we know better. Stop getting in there, disrupting these natural ecological controls that have maintained forests since Gondwana. And then once we understand where they are and where they work, we can actually get in and start reinforcing them as the climate changes. You can do things like put sprinklers in areas like this. You can put out a fire really easily. If you are aware where these areas are and you can rapidly detect a fire, then you can get remote area crews. I used to be a remote area firefighter. We call them RAFT in New South Wales, where you don't have water with you. You're just using hand tools and you have to put the fire out by hand. If we increase the number of raft crews that we have, we can get into these areas early. We can allow patches like that one in the background to recover and turn back into Peace Country. Yeah, I better finish up. I've gone over time, but yeah, so happy for any questions if anybody is still happy to hang around and talk.
That was really excellent. Thank you so much, Bill. I don't think we'll have a problem with people hanging around. I think plenty of discussion. Perhaps people are just totally stunned by the logic or the excellent rationale that you just provided. Okay. Would anyone like to ask any questions? And Mark, could you turn the light on so that we can see? There's a question at the back. Thanks.
Just towards the end there, I began to think, is there an area of research that you're aware of which is specifically examining the way fire authorities work and how they think?
Yeah, there are people who are looking at that. It's an area of social science. Um, and I mean, work's been done on that a lot over the years. Um, and I mean, it's hard to talk about. I mean, because you're dealing with you're talking about actual people, and it starts getting confronting. Then, there was one study that showed that there was an unhealthy level of pyromania amongst fire authorities, for example. And so if I know when I was working in fire management, um, if there was ever an arson fire, the first place you would look was amongst the firefighters as a likely arsonist. Um, but I'm not in any way suggesting that everybody that works in fire is inclined that way, but there is a correlation there, and part of the issue though is just the difficulty of bucking the trend when you are part of a culture. And particularly if you start developing a bit of a community amongst the people you work with, this is just how we operate. If somebody comes from the outside and says, "Oh, you're all pyromaniacs," or what you're doing is making the bush more flammable, or something like that, um, it comes across as an attack on your group, and you feel defensive of your group, even if you yourself might be able to see it and agree with it. There is some sort of um, just group pressure to defend your group, and we're all the same. We've all got little groups. If you think of a group that you value, that you are part of, and somebody criticizes you, your tendency will be to come to the defense of your group. And there's that. There's just the whole inertia that is inherent in changing government systems. There's the fact that a huge number of jobs rely on things not changing. Um, there's what feels like dignity for people. There's the fact that the fire world is filled with angry old men. It, it's an extremely masculine culture where we men know everything there is to know about fire, and you should not be questioning it. And if I come up with evidence that says otherwise, I will always have somebody come back to me furiously saying that they've been doing this since I was in nappies. And yeah, and there's no way you can argue around that. There's egos, there's all sorts of understandable things and less excusable things in there. It's a mixture. And then there's ultimately, in the end, there's just the question of who do you believe? If you are not personally an expert in something, you tend to believe people that you trust. And so when you see someone like me who's on the fringes, and then you're working with somebody else who also says that they're a scientist, and we both might seem equally smart to you, you'll believe the person that you trust.
Thanks for that, Phil. Just a couple of comments from online. One person has just said, wouldn't more jobs be created by introducing more cool burning, though? And this was in response to Irene's point that, where was that? Well, up. Irene said, this was a reply from Chris Hardman, Chief Fire Officer, to a concern about a planned burn. Field assessments have confirmed that rapid reaccumulation of fuels post the 2019-20 bushfire season, requiring the reintroduction of low-intensity fire into the landscape. So interesting.
Yeah. So I'll give me a second. I'll go back onto sharing screen again.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, so post the 1920 fires, rapid reintroduction of fuels, that's what we're seeing in this coloured section here, the rapid restoration of fuels there. And what we know from the long-term studies is that they will self-thin. But everything is focused on keeping it within that cycle.
Phil?
At
Yep.
the moment, you're sharing the presenter view, just so that the people at home only see the black screen. We've got seeing your notes though, your presenter screen.
I'll see if I can get the right screen up. How's that? Can you see that screen now? Yeah. So this shaded area here, Chris Hardman is focusing on this shaded area. This is what I was talking about before. You get this increasing trend straight after fire, and you can see all of that dense regrowth. It was caused by those fires. And so what he's saying is we need to burn it again, and yes, we will get it back down into that spot. And we can do that. Like if you look at any of these curves in the bottom left, we can burn so often that you're keeping everything to the left of that curve, but you'll lose one species after another. You will just have black forests. It's a form of clearing. The alternative is to find ways to strategically protect certain areas so that we get as much country as we can over that hump and into that long unburnt area. So as to that question before of won't we employ more people, I'd say actually no, because I mean, there's two parts to the answer. First one is we will employ more people if we have enough firefighters to do the rapid suppression that we need. So in 2019, to the west of Sydney, there was the Gospers Mountain Fire there. They got out to it when it was a 30-hectare fire, roughly around that size. It was a really good day for firefighting. They had 4 remote area firefighters to put onto it. You can't round up a 30-hectare fire with 4 people. As a result, they couldn't round it up. It got away and burnt 1 million hectares in the end. The question is, how many firefighters do you need? Would you have needed in that situation to round that fire up then? Because if we could do that, the whole story of the Black Summer would have been changed. Because as the season moved south from there, we ended up with no firefighters left to do anything because they were all tired out from fighting the Gospers Mountain Fire and the other fires to the north. So if we're able to get more of these fires when they're really small, then we could have changed the whole course of the Black Summer. So we will create jobs by employing more people to do more firefighting. But the other part of the question is, jobs happen when there's a problem to be fixed. So if we, for instance, made cars that didn't break down, we'd put all the mechanics out of jobs. If your computer didn't break down, then all of the IT people would be out of jobs. But is that an argument for doing things badly? If burning the bush more created more jobs, if it did do that, is that really an argument for doing that? Or shouldn't we just try to do things the best way? Shouldn't we just try to find the most effective way to manage country? And whether it creates more jobs or not, do the thing that reduces the fire risk.
Thanks, Bill. So a follow-up question is along those lines about doing things more strategically. Does thinning the understory shrubs help the remaining ones grow faster and speed up the process?
Generally speaking, no. As a general rule, the way the forest is growing, this is something that it's a way of doing things that has developed over many, many more times than humans have existed on Earth. The forests know what they're doing. So each time we get in there and think we know better than the natural system and think, well, if we just fix this one thing, we can make it all work. We're probably wrong. We've got to start with the assumption that we probably are wrong. Now, you can do it on a really small scale. I do it in my garden. I'll thin some plants and encourage others, but I have to stay on top of it. Because the thing is, if you pull out shrubs or if you thin those small saplings there, what happens is you now create a vacancy for something else to grow. And so you get new growth coming up after it. And so you've just reset things. And for a little while, you'll be better off. And if it's a really small area that you're constantly coming to, then yeah, that'll work. That's fine. You just keep coming back to that same area and treat it like a garden. But you can't do this across a whole landscape. First Nations could do this sort of thing really intensively along travel routes and things like that. But this is the thing where I was talking about fire use as being like a scalpel. You're not trying to change the whole landscape, the whole body. You're just focusing on that one thing, like the patch of shrubs that Uncle Rod used to burn, or the area that you burn every year to keep the ground clear for camping, or if you burn a patch to get fresh grass growth to attract kangaroos. There's no point burning that out to the horizon because then the kangaroos will be out on the horizon somewhere. Just burn the patch close to your travel route so that your food comes to you. There's sense in all of this. You can do stuff really intensively at a small scale, but if we try to apply this across a landscape, thinning invariably just resets the picture. And particularly if you're thinning trees, yes, you encourage growth in the remaining trees, but what that growth is not growth in height, it's growth in girth. Thinning is a tool that was developed for forestry to get you better saw logs faster. Trees grow tall when they're growing densely and racing each other for the light. And when they're tall, they are slowing the wind underneath them more effectively. They're less likely to catch fire in a crown fire. They are very effective as an ecological control. They allow taller mid-story plants underneath them. But if you thin them so that the remaining trees grow as shorter trees, even if they've got thicker trunks, then you lose some of that advantage.
Thank you, Phil. And just a follow-up question to that, hang on, Helen. What's your opinion of mulching rather than burning, which is being trialled in different areas?
Yep. Again, it's a thing that you can do as a really frequent high intensity thing in a specific area. So, for example, if you're wanting to clear fuel breaks around houses or something like that, I would recommend that over burning. You don't clear your gutters out by setting them on fire. So don't have fire right near the houses if you don't need to have it. If you can mulch them, then that's safer than setting it on fire. Also, there's the smoke. We know that the smoke has lethal effects on people. We can't ignore that. The smoke actually kills a lot more people than the actual fires do. So yes, it's a tool that can be used, but if you are going to try and use it across big landscapes, then again, you're getting rid of plants and new plants will grow back to replace them. So you're resetting things. So you've got to be doing it every year at the same spot. You can't do it and expect that it will stop a bushfire because that's just not how fire works. You'll get grasses growing back in no time, or things grow. The fire will just spread through the mulch itself. This idea of having huge fuel breaks, where you've got a road and a great wide area on the side of it that you've cleared underneath. I remember Victoria started doing that during the 2003 fires, and we were looking across the border, just thinking, what on earth is going on over there? Do they not realize fire can just spot over that thing? It's not going to stop anything. You've got embers blowing right across those areas so easily. Um, so yes, there is a place where you can use that sort of thing if you need a fuel break. Use it in a place where you can do it every year and where you will have people there with a hose and a truck at the time when a fire comes. Don't do it somewhere where you're wanting it to stop a fire by itself or do something along those lines.
Thank you so much, Phil. Now we've got a question from here. So I'm shifting from all those wonderful questions in the chat, and please we'll try and get to you, over to the people here. Go for it, Helen.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I really appreciate your views around the fact that traditional owner knowledge has not been lost, a view I often hear expressed. I wonder if you have any opinions about the Victorian traditional owner cultural fire strategy, which was developed with 50 traditional owner groups. Actually, sorry, not that many. Probably the participants were 50, but there was around 5 or 6 groups, including the Gippsland Land and Water Aboriginal Council, GLAWAC, and it aims to put traditional owners in the position of leading burns with the support of organisations such as Parks Victoria, CFA and DELP.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not familiar with the actual strategy. I haven't looked at that. What I'll say as a general response is that I am all for getting Indigenous fire regimes back into the landscape. And I've used that expression fire regimes rather than talking about cultural burning for a reason. It's a Western mentality that the thing that makes the difference is the burning. We see ourselves as managers. So we talk about managed forest and unmanaged is bad because we need to subdue the earth. We need to take charge of things. And so the thing that you are actively doing to change the environment, we see that as management and as good. Whereas in a Indigenous perspective, you see yourself not as a manager, but as part of the country, as in kinship with the other species. You are there living in that landscape with them, not above them. And so what you do with fire is not to manage the country. It's not to take charge of things. It is to have your specific little impact in the same way as a bandicoot scratches up a patch of ground. Bandicoot scratches up that patch of ground to get what it needs. And in so doing, it has a benefit. It spreads seeds, it spreads fungi, it digs humus into the soil, that sort of thing. If that bandicoot decided, well, I'm having a benefit, so therefore I should be in charge and dig up the whole landscape, then things would be bad. And that's effectively what's happened with us. We get a little bit too full of ourselves and think we should be in charge of things that we shouldn't be. So I suppose I've got a long way of saying this here, but I think Aboriginal fire regimes are different because what they mean is that you can have Uncle Rod doing his burns there to create a shrub layer. Even though that makes that shrub layer more flammable there, that doesn't matter because that's just a little patch just around the campsite so that they can get fruit. It's okay to have some flammable spots because the rest of the landscape that he didn't burn is open. He's allowed it to open up. He's got other patches along his travel route there where there's patches of bare ground that they can go and stand in if there's a fire that comes through. He's got other areas out on the grassland that they've burnt where there's freshly burnt grass that's attracting bustard and emus and kangaroos and that sort of thing. All it is this whole different mix there. But overall, you've got this matrix of long unburnt forest with little patches all the way through it of really frequently managed gardened area. And so what I am wary of is, first of all, Aboriginal knowledge wasn't lost. It was stolen. It was destroyed. It was a conscious thing, a conscious effort made to get rid of that knowledge. So the knowledge that is there is priceless. And there is something that really riles me when you get First Nations people trying to take up that knowledge again and trying to patch together bits of knowledge sometimes and trying to get back on their feet with this. If Western agencies try to then retrofit that back into our world and say, okay, you burnt that little patch there, can you do that to 10,000 hectares? No, it's not the same. That's the same as MacArthur saying, oh, you used a fire stick, I'm going to throw out incendiaries from my plane, and that's the same as lighting fire sticks all over the place. No, that's cultural appropriation. It is completely misdirecting what's intended there. Cultural burning was not to protect our towns. It wasn't for the purposes that we have. As cultural fire comes back into the landscape, it should be done for cultural reasons. There shouldn't be pressure to try and make it fit all of our needs so that we can continue living our particular Western lifestyle. Absolutely, we should learn from it. We should see if there are things that can be done. To me, the Yandella example is a fantastic thing that I feel I've learnt from it. But there will be so many other different ways that we can learn. Sorry, that's a really long answer. I don't know if it's given you what you're after.
That's wonderful. Now, there's just a couple of comments that are a little bit related in the chat. One person says, currently I work around FFM Vic and can confirm completely saturated with ego-fueled men that claim to know better. Ground crew are completely at the whim of their opinions and instructions. I've seen time and time again that those firefighters with good conscience and forest health front of mind, forced to put more fire in and hurriedly move through with fire as the end of the day looms and they lose their burning window. Many of those in charge just see target percentages and numbers they have to reach in fuel reduction. With the current structure and mindset, this will continue indefinitely. This person says, how do we make them listen? Now, that's related to an earlier point, and that was, just bear with me, picking up on what you've just said about reactive points in agencies and individuals. What might be a good point to start a conversation with a view to a broader invitation to consider the current research and consideration of changing practice? So what's our entry point, I suppose, Phil? Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's such a hard question because having worked in fire management, the people I worked with were well aware of what was happening. There were times when it was a common thing that firefighters would talk about these being fuel production burns. That we would have a prescribed burn on the schedule, but we'd be waiting for safe weather to conduct this burn. And somewhere on high, somebody had called in to Alan Jones on the radio and said, national parks aren't doing enough prescribed burning, and there'd been pressure from the community. And so we'd get this message coming down from on high, you have to do that burn this week. And there's a gale force wind blowing. and we would have pitched battles sometimes where you would have fire crews and on-ground staff who knew their country. There were times there were areas where they were nearly in revolt, and these aren't all, you know, hippies that have come in here or anything like that. These are multi-generational farmers who got a job with national parks to supplement the farming income, that sort of thing. And they look at these places and they'd say, look at this dense understory we've created. We've made the fire risk here. We did this. And people were living with this huge guilt. And there were times when I actually stopped talking to people about it. Once I'd done my PhD and I was still working in this, there were times I felt so sorry for the other staff there that I just didn't even raise the subject with them because they just felt guilty. They were trying to change the system from within. They thought, that you need people in here who can see it, and we can just keep pushing on this. So they tend not to be the people that need convincing. Once you've got somebody who knows their country well, who's seen what happens with it over time, and who knows how fire works in that country, then they usually don't need convincing. There are some people who've just swallowed the Kool-Aid and nothing will ever change their mind. But so I suppose my approach is that, every year, well, not every year, but quite regularly, if I was going to work on the fire ground, I had to do just a little refresher test from time to time where I had to recite all of the official lines like double the fuel load, double the rate of spread, stuff that I knew to be completely wrong, but I had to show that I knew it. And it was just this kind of, I'm sure somebody had good intentions in there to start with, but it's almost like we're all being gaslit. And we're just constantly being told, no, you've just got to do this. This is the right way to do things. And particularly the pressure lately has mounted so much. And there's so little long unburnt country left that a lot of people don't actually know what it looks like. So I would say be gentle with the stuff. If you know of examples of long unburnt places that have opened up, that sort of thing, point them out to them. Just have a friendly conversation with them, but do it in a way of just reassuring them, no, you're not mad. All of this stuff that you've been thinking all this time, yes, it's true, and just hang on to it and know that it's true and persist, because we need that internal pressure. In the end, it's going to be a change at the top, at the politics. It may be something that happens through courts. It won't be something that happens with on-ground fire staff. But when it starts to break at the top, then you'll have this army of fire crews who know this stuff, of land managers who know this stuff, and they'll be there ready to rebuild.
Thanks so much for that, Phil. And I suppose one last question to honour those that are in the chat. If we want to prevent fire, this is a little bit of what you've already been talking about, Phil. If we want to prevent fire, if we want to burn to prevent fire, to keep things under that 1%, do we have to permanently remove the understory to gain ongoing fire prevention benefits? And you said yes. Is this forest reduction or landscape alteration a clearing of the bush that isn't actually accounted for in environmental regulation? It doesn't seem to think about that, does it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is land clearing. And that is what we need to have clear in our minds. If you want to burn to stop bushfires, what you need to be doing is land clearing. Leave the trees there, but clear the vegetation underneath. You are trying to cause the extinction of those plants underneath, the localized extinction of them. Now, that can only happen still with really ongoing work. Because if you cause the loss of, say, just a colonizing species through some frequent fire, then you'll get other species that come in. And I'm actually, I've got a paper in review at the moment where I've shown that you can actually make a forest flammable for longer by getting rid of some species. Because you've just broken the system there. And it's still trying to limp along. But yes, it needs to be counted as a form of land clearing.
Many thanks, Phil. And I don't think, all right, everyone is looking a little shell-shocked, I think, at the implications of what you've presented, which has been absolutely fabulous. Could everyone please make your applause known?
Could I make one suggestion or request, just as a thought? If you've got country that you know, that you've seen over a long period of time, and you've got records or photos of what it looked like, compile them. Try and get that stuff together. Make sure that we keep these memories of what country used to look like, and how things have changed over time, because that's what we're losing now. We're losing that long-term perspective. Yeah.
Wonderful, evocative, absolutely fabulous presentation, Phil. Thank you so much for making yourself available to us.
My pleasure.
Absolutely brilliant. So everyone, we're going to allow Phil to have his Friday night, maybe an early night. He's looking a little bit tired in my eyes. Phil, thank you from Latrobe Valley, and yes, we'll keep up the good fight. Thanks, Phil, and we'll send you the recording if you wish, and everyone else will be putting the recording on the LV Field Nats website, including some really fabulous comments from everyone, Phil. Everyone's very, very impressed and thankful for your information.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good night.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for your patience, everyone.
We had about 53
I'm going to.
53 people online.
Anyway.